So hey Nime fans. The series name is What If Naruto Got Harem with Skyrim? So let's start the series. Why do I see Skyrim's loading screen? Ashken inquired, obviously bewildered since he couldn't remember what he had been doing before. The game's nostalgic opening theme, which he had heard innumerable times, began with the line, and the music is also playing. Was it a dream? He thought. If so, it was definitely quite vivid, as he gazed at the ever-growing Alduin seated at the word wall. To be honest, though, it appeared that everything was composed of cheap plastic. Was it also the case in the game? It was a valid point that the likeness was only the product of Ashken's active imagination, because, even if he couldn't recall, he would have expected a better quality game. And the scrolls have foretold, of black wings in the cold, that when brothers wage war come unfurled. Was the text message that hovered close to Alduin, but it was highly unlikely that he would have recalled it. Alduin, the Bane of Kings, is an unbridled ancient darkness that longs to eat up the whole planet. The Dragonborn's song. Although the words weren't written on the word wall, he figured they would have appeared on the loading screen of the game. It was also notable because there was a large level 1 bar in the upper right corner. The text was a far cry from his writing style and his potential body of work. After waiting patiently for a few seconds, he concluded that he could no longer live in doubt and carried on with his contemplation. Since the cutscene is obviously playing continually with odd flashing, it makes sense that it wouldn't fit in with most dreams. Alright, this is getting pretty crazy. I can't feel my body or do anything. Either I am dreaming about dreaming, in other worlds an inception, like in this one movie, and in that case, I'm only having these observations and thoughts, while the cutscene is imagined, he stated, before continuing. Or either it was caused by some random omnipotent being, he said. Ashken giggled as he waited and responded, right, certainly, no other feasible option, like getting brain injury, participating in brain implant experiment in the future, which is blocking off his perception of the world and some memories, or any other likely possibility, just Rob. In fact, the game was becoming ever more terrifying at these moments, because there was a higher than 50% risk that it might crash when played on a computer. After a few minutes of complete boredom and nothing to do, the loading screen vanished and the darkness arrived. However, as soon as it did, he began to see odd colors and hazy images that were disrupting it. He was confused for a time before being inundated with quest logs. Although there were no quests available, there were instructions to tab out of the first window, which was located in the center of the notebook, and described what a quest journal is. It was a standard in-game menu where users could view their tasks, general metrics, and system information. There was a level in the center, a date in the right corner, and S to cancel on the left side of the bottom. When he said out loud, tab, it closed, which was, to be honest, a fortunate assumption on his part. Ashken made the decision to visit the general statistics window. It turned out that he just needed to focus on clicking it, as he would with a mouse, and everything fell into place. The general statistics page had an unusual name because it simply tracked the player's progress up to this point, including information on the number of animals killed, locks unlocked, spells used, etc. When he saw that everything was showing 0 or none, he navigated to the system page. When he found he could adjust the audio and display, he switched off the music and turned on the conversation and general subtitles. The quick save, and load buttons were broken, the mods were not showing anything, the settings were locked out on legendary difficulty, and he enabled the display of floating markers. The health section was not very helpful. It was merely a copy and paste of the game's health section with some definitions for terms. Beyond the screens, Ashken could barely make out a portion of a brown carpet and a wooden wall. He was unsure whether time had stopped, like in the game, or if it was still running. Other than the obvious that he was most likely indoors, he had no idea where he was in Skyrim. Tab again, Ashken thought to himself, perhaps I'll get access to the map. There was a tingle in his muscles and skin, the small tension and release that comes with breathing, and he could move his eyes, you know. He remained there for a while, absorbing everything, and when he realized he was standing, he staggered a little on his feet, but did not pass out. He turned and was in a hallway with 2 candles at either end, a mirror at the other, and a wooden door at one end. There were other smaller doors at the ends of the corridors that connected to other rooms, and a free corridor beneath the entry arch. He hit tab to turn it on. All feelings vanished, and 4 possibilities emerged. Magic, skills, items, and map. Like in the game, he chose map to see Ashken's house as the current location. That is comforting, he said, somewhat relieved that he at least had a place to reside that seemed secure. He was immediately astounded when he clicked on world map. His only reference was the map, which showed the unexplored region, but it was neither of Tamriel or Skyrim. Konoha was the place. For 15 seconds, his mind froze as he considered the implications of his discovery. Oh, he said to himself. He reassessed his position in the world and said, maybe it is not so bad, at least there is a chance I won't have to deal with Deidre or ancient entities, well aside from Satsuki. He shrank at the idea of a multi-world with both Tamriel and elemental nations, complete with gods, the afterlife, and planes of both worlds, such as Oblivion and Pure Areas. God, please don't let it be some kind of Frankenstein crossover of two worlds, he yelled. After emerging from his mild coma, he looked at the maps of various places for a while, before going back to the other choices. He pointed out that these were different from Skyrim's possessions, and oddly, he even added briefs and socks, but only his outfits, which were his equipped stuff, were displayed under items. Well, Ashken said nonchalantly, expressing his particular choice, I need to buy boxers, or something, much more comfortable. Even though the 150 kilograms weight limit in survival mode was unusual, he conducted more tests to see how everything was cooperating. When he utilized the menu to take off his shirt, it abruptly became unequipped and revealed his bare torso to the public. Pulling it out by hand would record it as an object with the prompt Ashken's shirt, prompting him to take it, which would return it to his inventory. Noting that it was not equipped or in his inventory, he donned the clothes alone. As he removed it, it was removed from his items, and no longer listed as an equipped item. Additionally, he became aware that the time difference between his stops and the real world was only 1 minute. He was able to determine the precise hour when he glanced at a date, and realized it was not a Skyrim date, but rather the year 55, the 23rd day of a particular month, and a specific day of a named week. He was unable to decipher the meaning of the date because it was written in Japanese or a similar language, but he utilized the hours and minutes as a guide. In light of the fact that the minutes remained constant throughout his tests, he came to the conclusion that time actually stops, or at least slows down considerably. In the extremely unusual event that he enters the menu, the time meter just stops working and disconnects from reality. Next he went to the magic menu, noting with delight that he had some powers in the all section, such as the usage of healing and flames. Healing is op, Ashken reflected on the potential outcomes in-game. Would he be able to recover from any harm? Is he like a character in a video game, or does he have the capacity to be damaged? Breathing underwater in Skyrim frequently required a specific magic, but Ashken was carefully planned. The game avatar can't really lose limbs or head, well, aside from decapitation, but it is only if one dies. Ashken chose to try injuring and healing myself later, because he was still in the magic choice window, and then he shrugged his head. Not only could those two spells be employed, but there was also a special active effect. Chakraborn is a resource that combines stamina and magicka. How strong it is depends on the user's current health. All Ashken could think as he read it was, weird. He chose to proceed and take in the familiar Skyrim stars while he traveled to the skills. Ashken said, no change here, but he was actually rather pleased to see that the two greatest Skyrim benefits were still present. Well, Ashken remarked mockingly, most important for exploiters, like myself. For 70 and 100 skill points in restoration and alteration, respectively, they were transformed into Necromage and Atronach. What made them so crucial? Since those two were glitched in the game, if the player was drinking the Strength and Restoration potion, they would receive a permanent boost that would last long after the potion wore out. The only drawback is that there was a glitch in the game that prevented the user from using conjuration magic when the effect was at least 100%. That is the openness of spell absorption in Skyrim. If he could replicate even a little part of the fortification restoration glitch loop, he would convert it into magicka, thanks to Atronach, and he would be able to absorb any talents, skills, spells, poisons, or anything else that might be remotely magical that came his way. The second benefit. Necromage basically increases the potency of all spells against undead, and is susceptible to fortify restoration. The real power of this perk is that it works even on the user, greatly increasing the potency of all his boosting or support spells when used on himself. Edo Tensei might work because it requires undeadness to use, but it seems unlikely that it would be safe in Naruto, thus he would have to pass. You have to have a Tornach, Necromage. Risky, maybe later, replying Ashken. To be honest, he could become god and invincible to everything if he could obtain ingredients for a fortified enchantment potion, and, ideally, components for strengthening restoration and enchantment of fortified alchemy. However, where could I locate those spells and elements? Ashken was instantly appalled by the potential consequences of it being the other realm. Ashken was feeling better. But then, the shirt I have on is a new item of this world that system still recognizes, maybe there will be some equivalence. He quickly established himself as a favorite bar under the Q mental command by using healing and fires for the first and second mental keys. But he quickly came back to reality because he had nothing else to do with the menus. Getting used to the fact that time was on and off, he stumbled to the mirror. Walking felt weird, like he was dragging his feet, and each time he set his next foot down, it felt more like he was walking on a cold stump of alien flesh than his own. He saw a young, adolescent man in the mirror, tall and thin, with thick, short black hair and obsidian eyes. Compared to his previous self, who was smaller, muscular, with brown hair and blue eyes, this was a big change. In particular, his chin and facial bones didn't suit his aesthetic and didn't appeal to him. He discovered that by using his left hand to access his healing magic, he could call forth the whirling ball of energy within of him. He decided to try to fix his face, but no matter how long he held it, nothing seemed to change. Seeing the bar on the left corner was empty, he quickly dropped below 50 Michika. He didn't really feel anything about it, didn't know how the spell worked, and wasn't sure how he used his Michika. When using a remote controller playing a game, pressing and releasing a button was equivalent to turning it on. In any case, his face would be with him for the rest of his life. However, he noticed a fine letter opener next to the mirror. Though he wasn't sure if it would make him ill, he wanted to gently prickle the top of his palm. Also, because he currently had no remedy for any ailments, it might end terribly. As a result, he started by looking around his house, and soon discovered the kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, and other nearly new appliances. Some of them looked like 100-year-old antiques by his normal standards, but they were functional. He had a refrigerator, a gas stove, and what appeared to be a toilet and shower. Ashken persuaded himself, no bad, since at least he was spared from having to give up his comforts and standards. He located a functional knife in a kitchen, gave it a thorough cleaning, turned on a stove, and briefly dipped the knife into flames. When he examined the knife in the inventory, he was shocked to see that it had more basic damage when heated. Subsequent tests revealed that it remained at that temperature continuously during storage, but that when it cooled down properly, the additional damage was removed. Fairly interesting, Ashken thought, but he wasn't really shocked given what he had already witnessed. Regretfully, the wound did not mend itself, most likely as a result of survival mode being triggered. He conducted a series of straightforward tests, including deeper cuts and pricking his skin until it was bleeding, and everything recovered fairly well. His mana was also recovered by game rates. He stabbed himself on the left hand once he was more comfortable. When something became stuck inside, he saw that the damage he had already received rapidly increased to double, 3 times, and so forth. He also noticed that while mending after being stabbed, health points were restored. Yet, stabbing injuries persisted at 1-second intervals. He diligently recorded that a spell could now completely cure it after removing the sword when his health reached 80. It was particularly useful since, despite being stabbed, he was still able to move his limbs freely. It appeared to be the same as in the game that one might be pierced by an ice lance or an arrow, and just ignore it. He wiped the small amount of blood on the counter with a dish towel. Now that he feels overconfident, he has searched for a variety of illnesses. However, the primary distinction is that it would have remained harmful well inside the wound. Healing it would not have miraculously taken it out of the body. He also distinguished between cut, stab, and prickle, noting that they all consumed the same quantity of HP. He quickly discovered that one-handedness had risen to 16 at the summit. Soon after, Restoration received similar news. He continued by saying that he found the sight unsettling, even though he experienced no pain or problems during the procedure. Yeah, it is an effective method of leveling up, and I'll probably have to do it someday, but maybe let's try other avenues first, he said. In fact, it could be fairly suspicious if someone has seen this, Ashken reflected as he looked over the mess he had created. He's even thought about being on guard all the time. It makes sense because it's a ninja hamlet with a sizable Byakugan user base and other unpleasant surprises. He took a shower and washed his clothes in the sink, hoping to get rid of the evidence. After cleaning up for approximately an hour, he used the items he had already discovered in the refrigerator to make himself some dinner because he had time till the afternoon. At first, he was concerned that ninjas would be watching sewers, and that if they notice blood leaking, they may gather samples and identify him as a source. However, the crime had already been done, and it would have been even more foolish to risk throwing it outside in front of dog owners. He was surprised to see that he was ignoring all of that. Yes, it was a change of environment for him, and he wasn't in his trusted body if that's how it was described. In addition, he wasn't cooking in his own kitchen, which excited him, but may have irritated others. He was satirizing the entire situation by laughing at it. It was the result of his sporadic study of his philosophy, which holds that a person is nothing more than the sum of their experiences. Usually, a person's personality would change over time, followed by a few incidents that reinforced their perspective. Ashken wanted to experience everything, even pretentiously, thus he would frequently step outside of his comfort zone to expand his horizons. He wanted to avoid the norm, attempt to observe things from other angles, and see as many points of view as he could. But his ideal would never come true, and he was certainly only a human. Additionally, there are things he would never do or ever wanted to do. Life has its share of obstacles and pitfalls, and he doesn't want to occasionally bathe in excrement in order to feel everything. Though not everything is as beautiful as it seems, it is his ideal, and he typically sees it as guidance, rather than a strict set of laws about what he should or shouldn't do. In certain ways, it can be seen as finding a middle ground between upholding basic human decency and attempting to explore new concepts and ways of thinking. His lack of pain, which he had confirmed seconds before, may have made him a little braver under the situation, or it may have been sheer stupidity. He only wished to verify how little prickle causes harm, as he had already escalated it to full-fledged self-mutilation training. However, since the harm was only brief, it could be disregarded in favor of the benefits Ashken negotiated with himself, in an attempt to appease his ego. However, he was successful in his attempt and made the decision to try again later, perhaps in a slightly more controlled setting where he wouldn't create such a mess, like over a sink or in the shower. He focused on the kitchen to prepare his lunch for the time being, because his hunger bar was still developing, although slowly. But as soon as he placed a pot of water on a stovetop with a gas burner flickering beneath it, a miracle prompt with the words, "Press E to use" appeared. "No-brainer," he said, mocking the idea that he would turn down the offered knowledge. He didn't mind that a crafting menu from the game appeared when he used it. There were no other possibilities because the necessary items were not available, so he closed the window and made a list of every ingredient he had in the kitchen in his inventory. When he tried the request again, he saw that other soups and stews were available to cook or as a craft. He made everything he could, including several stews and vegetable soup, 5 times. Unfortunately, Skyrim survival mode introduces a number of bothersome elements, and they are annoying if you have to deal with them. He would much rather enjoy free health regeneration than be cold, hungry, or sleep deprived. However, the inability to move quickly between locations is probably the most harmful of them. Other factors include the ease of contracting diseases and illnesses, the decreased carry weight, and lastly the fact that leveling up is only possible while you're asleep. Pure joy, Ashken remarked with a cheeky grin. It's not hilarious, but at least he could get to work cooking right away. Ashken considered his current circumstances, unsure if he felt safe enough to murmur to himself, "Now, regarding the next course of action, reconnaissance would be useful, to understand where I live, also, if I have a job or not, and how to pay my taxes and where." Then, like a wrecking ball, a crucial thought struck him. "I can't speak Japanese," he realized with a gnawing ping of sadness, but it subsided a little as an idea gripped him. Ashken said, trying to regain control, "All right, let's find some books and see what I'm working with." After looking around, he discovered a number of books in one of the trunks. They were very worn out, and when he opened them he saw what he had assumed to be an incomprehensible script. However, since he had English language options configured elsewhere and they appeared to be books, he decided to read them and added them to his inventory. Similar to the game, the novel began in English, and focused on the establishment of the hamlet and the rival clans. It was 100 pages long at most. One issue was that, even though he could understand the meaning of the letters, if he had studied it with 2 other volumes and somehow recalled them all, he would not know how to pronounce them. Only a few Japanese words from anime were familiar to him, and even then, he could only recognize them by their phonemes. This was not Romaji writing, but the true pictorial language of kanji. That is, he would never be able to speak Japanese, no matter how long he hid in his home. He must thus go listen to others. Aside from the fact that learning to read and write kanji would likely need months or perhaps years of consistent effort, being mute or deaf would be a far better option. However, it would be extremely suspicious, impolite, or difficult to review the words without bringing it to his inventory if he asked someone to write on a note. In theory, he could just sneak into Konoha, wander around and read the subtitles as people spoke. Reading the subtitles instead of skulking around was great. A ninja town like this one is typical. However, is it possible for a man of his age to work covertly anywhere in Konoha? How about a sauna? That bathhouse is open to the public. However, he didn't have to sidestep inquiries and risk rejection as a peeker. But even if anime characters like Jiraiya do it all the time, it doesn't mean it would be proper nor safe to do so, he reasoned. "I could just practice sneaking and listen to conversations there," he said. "I didn't know," he remarked, adding, "Is it possible to activate stealth while sitting in the bathtub? Would it even work?" He had more questions than answers, though. He chose to test his sneaking skills by going straight into a lower level, bending forward somewhat with his legs bowed, and then deciding to see how far he could go. He started to slowly straighten his back, and pondered whether simple actions would cause him to feel fatigued at all. It seemed a little strange to be in his sort of squat, sit-up position, but he didn't feel any burning or exhaustion in his legs. Determined to try this right away, he slid to the ground and began performing push-ups, 1, 2, 3, 120. He was breathing regularly, his arms were free of burns and other injuries. He attempted various odd positions, planches, and even got up and performed some jumps. He was still in the sneaking mode even when he was standing, and it felt perfectly normal to do so. He could even jump or walk in that manner, but there was always this horizontal bar in the center of his vision that told him he was hidden. That was the only significant detail. He even attempted to sprint, but it was completely broken and didn't use any stamina, just as his prior self-mutilation stabs and slashes didn't in retrospect. When he tried to think left-click, his body instantly twisted back into stealth mode, and he used his stamina to do the general sneak attack in Skyrim. He then tried the same attack again, this time without using any stamina, and he checked various attacks. He ran both with and without sprint mode during his final testing. Initially, the only difference was that he was able to run normally, sprinting as usual, and that, despite being awkwardly positioned against the wall, he was able to swiftly reach his maximum speed while sprint mode was on. There was only one final test he could think of, so he went to a cupboard and attempted to lift it with one hand, but he encountered some resistance, and was unable to pick it up by the edge like a plate, and when he braced his feet on the floor, he could only move it sideways. However, he had no trouble lifting it with two hands. The chair could be moved around as easily as a knife and held by a leg or by its back with full grip, but he was unable to lift the table with one arm. He tried holding the table to measure, and found that he could move it around like a rag doll with both arms, with what felt like the limit of his abilities. Further testing showed that the less leverage he had, the more forcefully he could grasp it with one hand. That is, it did not shake or tire, it moved like a rag doll if you could lift something, and it conformed to the normal grip mechanics of an arm, which happens to be several times stronger than normal. Even though his body obviously followed the preservation of the center of gravity, which required bracing feet and slightly bent legs, in addition to bending the rest of the body to create counterweight, the speed at which he could move objects that he could lift and position in ways that defied biomechanics did not appear to change. Even though there was a limit to how hard he could press the table against the wall, the inertia or powerful pressures did not seem to damage his arm or make it more difficult for him to raise the thing on his own. He burned it for 2/3 of an hour, cleaned up, and got ready to leave. Since he had nothing better to do, he decided to search the streets for a bathrobe, towel, and stylish shoes and some cash, of course. Would he be breaking any Japanese customs by not bringing anything or taking what he was entitled to? Most likely, but he'll just have to pretend to be a dim-witted, shy man who mostly just shakes his hand awkwardly, or says a few elementary phrases he knows. Or I'll just wing it on the fly, Ashken shrugged, assuming. Konnichiwa is a greeting, domo or arigato when he queries or want to avoid anything, and o genki da as a closing statement. What, indeed, he murmured, looking at a ceiling as he prepared to depart, wondering how things might go wrong. He put on his stealth mode again after leaving his house and discovering a key hanging on the wall to seal the door, and he found himself in a tiny residential complex with 3 apartments on the first floor and a few shops below. No loading screen was required. He thought it would be rather strange to wander around the city in a bathrobe and look for onsen, so he packed all his goods in the bag he was carrying, and walked casually to the stairs on the left. There were dead ends and alleys where one had to climb to the roofs or meet a little clearing of trees to cross, and tens of hundreds of different bridges dangling between taller structures. The difference in elevation between Konoha's streets and districts was remarkable. There were more staircases dotted throughout, and it really did feel like a metropolis mixed with a forest. Ashken was now mostly traveling in the opposite direction from the Hokage monument, following alleys that would hopefully lead him to the outskirts, where he could see tiny water currents flowing through the various districts of the village. The map showed all of the streets, and significant locations that had recently been visited were constantly being added. Because it was still before noon and he could only see the tangle of side streets, most of which were empty, he had time, even though he could have misjudged the distance to his goal, and frequently utilized the interactive map to better understand the layout. It was obviously livelier there, with tens of people conversing about everything at kiosks, plazas, playgrounds, and all other gathering spots, until he finally emerged from the winding back streets after more than 30 minutes. His level bar was full, but because of survival mode, he would have to wait until he was asleep in bed to level up, so he chose to evaluate the street in light of possible information collecting for the time being, and as a prompt about sneaking reaching level 18 arrived, he heard a man shouting. There were too many people there to hear any conversations, so he proceeded to one of the open convenience stores, where the employees greeted him, and he learned a new greeting term. He simply nodded and went to the rear to look at ingredients and other items. He ignored the opportunity to steal the products when he took some juice from a cartoon and an onigiri, but as he made his way to the checkout, he noticed an innocent-looking Icha paradise tucked away amid the little assortment of books that the establishment also offers. He reached the bookcase, pulled out a copy of the book, and placed it in the direction of the store clerk, as he silently approached the counter. By reading the subtitles, Ashken was able to understand what the expert was saying. "Hello, valued client," is that all? He bowed slightly and murmured, "Hi," before beginning to figure out the entire cost. "Please, all is 84 ryo, said the clerk, and then he gave his price. Ashken grabbed 100 ryo out of his pocket and gave it to the clerk, after discovering 3 500 ryo notes, 5 100 ryo notes, and some coins at home that he was unsure of their value. Somehow, the English numbers on the bills helped, and the cashier gave him a 10 ryo banknote, a larger silver coin, and a golden coin. The words he heard to say farewell were "Arigato" and "Please come again," which he learned to say to the cashier as he was leaving the store. At the next convenience shop, he saw a small crowd and chose to stay a little while, buying more food or drinks and listening to the conversations. However, after packing his belongings, there wasn't much space left in the bag. The woman and a youngster, possibly a mother and daughter, were discussing the value of punctuality. However, why do courses start at 8 a.m. if we are expected to get there by 7:45? The child yelled. The woman quietly replied, Swithirti, it isn't a good manner to always be prior to the appointed time, remembering her mother's comment that it was a quality of ladies and lords to never be late. But, Mom, the teacher often shows there at 8 a.m. or even a few minutes later. The daughter, not persuaded, protested. As if she knew all the answers, she told her daughter, yes, sweetie, but he is an adult to you, and you need to respect your elders. Those meeting hours are for you, not for him, and most importantly, she said, pausing, remember that what is allowed for faculty members is not allowed for students. But shouldn't he also be polite? Said a youngster, looking for a flaw in her mother's reasoning. Sunshine, the job of the teacher has many responsibilities. As a position it not only deserves a certain respect, but also is unforgiving in the number of obligations entailed with it, the mother went on to explain to her daughter, as she prepared to be served next in a checkout line. Sweetie, have you perhaps considered that maybe some wayward student have interrupted him going to the classroom? Or maybe he had to talk to this also. She picked up a jelly candy and handed it to the cashier, asking, the headmaster or other teacher. No, the girl replied, as she looked ashamed at the ground. Please, she begged, as the clerk added, it will be 18 ryo. The woman handed the cashier the money she owed after a few moments of fumbling with coins. Honey, I'm sure Mr. Tamari is professional in what he is doing, and you should trust him more in that he had good reason for whatever he was late for, she remarked, leaving her daughter packing the items she had purchased. Ashton purchased additional chocolate sticks in the meanwhile, and while he observed that the cashier's comments were largely same from the previous one, he was still unaccustomed to paying for quantities larger than 10, so he carefully examined the ryo numbers he was required to pay. It appeared that the Second Shinobi War was coming to a close, and people were feeling optimistic about the future, so he shrugged, opened the snack, and began eating as he strolled down the street, reading the subtitles of the general talks whenever he could. Unfortunately, he only remembered that the timeline was complicated and frequently contradicted itself, and he didn't know how long it would be until the Third Shinobi War based on year 55 on the menu. He decided to go to the source after looking from where the water was flowing, because the air was a little more humid than he had anticipated, and the water seemed to be warming the area a little. He didn't have to wait long because he quickly located the location he was looking for, which was the bridge over the river he had been traveling toward. With more obscene structures like gambling dens, booze salons, and loud food street vendors, the ambience was also livelier and more akin to a cross between an entertainment district and a vacation resort. Now, looking back, the once empty back streets seemed more rational, and he recognized that the people's mood had changed from earlier streets. They were less concerned about the war and what was happening here. Since this was the Shinobi War, he wasn't entirely sure how that worked, but he opened the curtains, shrugged, and passed through what he assumed was the bathhouse's exterior entrance, based primarily on the people entering and leaving. Normally, more people, like injured veterans or refugees, occupy such places during wartime. A sign with prices appeared behind the clerk, but Ashton could not see it, and he was unsure of how to explain that he needed a single ticket. He made the right decision when he noticed that there were different doors for men and women, and that someone was serving people. As was to be expected, he chose to wing it. According to the guy shouting in Fairy Tale, he recently learned that Kekadesu means no thank you, and Domo arigato means thank you very much. Being confident was crucial, so he boldly declared, Ichi, while displaying a single finger, and then added, Atoko, before setting 10 ryo on the counter. He also discovered that Ichi is one, and that Atoko is a man in Japanese. After examining him, the woman in charge said, we rent out bathroom facilities. Would you like any? He answered, no, thank you, after reading the subtitles in her most recent response. He appeared to have learned the phrase for the bathroom, but he began to feel depressed because he had nothing to wear. After reconsidering his decision, Ashton mentally corrected himself, saying, not like I could anyway, it would be quite weird. Then it is 7 ryo, pleasant stay was the woman's response after collecting the note. She was on her way to the next customer when she lost 3 golden coins. Presuming the blue door was for men and the pink for women, Ashton turned and entered. When he found a place to dry his washing towel and walked into the Sento's area, he found a few chairs and a couple of showers mounted on the walls. He had already taken a shower before leaving his house, but he took another one there without really cleaning himself or using soap the second time, because no one seemed to care about him either. They were small, possibly accommodating 6 persons without causing discomfort to one another, and there were plenty of them with various indicators indicating varying temperatures. However, he sank directly into the hottest one, apparently unaware of the temperature difference, although there were already 4 men seated in the center of one area, 1 elderly man lounging in the warmest one, and no one in the least hot one. Psycho, he murmured to himself, not entirely understanding what that meant, but he believed he had heard it frequently in an anime, and that it was a suitable response, a way to show satisfaction, or something. There's nothing like stretching your legs in a hot bath once in a while, the grinning old man added. Those old bones of mine feel as if they were young, again, hahaha. That's correct, he added. Guy number 1 said, old man, you are not too old, you look fantastic in your age, from the tub next to it. Your grandpa is still kicking your ass in sparrings, isn't he? He asked courteously. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you did put quite the show for a name, that time. Wait, he replied. PFFT, as if he didn't throw you on your ass too. He turned to face him with sadistic eyes, and put a hand to his brow, as though he was trying to remember, oblivious to the embarrassment on guy number one's face. You said that you would kick my ass no problem, as you are so much better of the two of us, yet you lost in 15 seconds, licking the dirt, he added. He asked, want a reminder? Anytime, you bastard, the first man said, splashing the second man with water. He turned his head away and put his arms across his chest, saying, deny all you want, but 2 weeks later, it was you who was eating shit. That there were no witnesses doesn't nullify the results, he stated. Guy number one made fun of Hidachi by making hand movements, as though there were no remedies for the alignment that his friend was obviously going through. Still, you and your imaginary fights, get real Hidachi, he said. This is off, Hikaru heaved Hidachi's words were. After they both straightened up, the old man said, language lads. And chastised them more, adding, and behave, we are in a public place. Both of them shouted back, yes. The old veteran swore and began to shake his head in frustration. The boys laughed a little at their own antics. Do you believe those two scumbags survived the brutal conflict? He asked Ashken. I can't believe what a miracle it was that my family was so blessed to return whole, and then, without giving him a chance to respond, he glanced at Ashken and shed a tear or two, as if he was trying to read his reaction. What can I say? Ashken asked himself. I have literally said yes, no, or farewell, but I know one more word that would be quite impolite. Any answer that isn't disagreeable could demand more words from him, which could be difficult. The elderly man gave him a startled expression, but Ashken didn't understand that his words didn't mean what he had thought they would. Oyasuminasai, Ashken replied, pushing the man aside and then lying down and gazing up at the ceiling. Given that good night is oyasumi, his words could have been interpreted as good evening, as is frequently the case with Japanese. It has a secondary meaning, yet in other contexts it is a polite greeting. Ashken had thought it meant good night, and that he might have excused himself from further discussion in some way. The elderly guy grinned and said, thank you, young man, before turning to face the ceiling and staring at the other man, as though his words had rejuvenated his old weary spirit. Yes, I may finally rest, now that they are safe, the other man added. Yes, let's all have good rest and allow our bodies and minds to recuperate, said one of the two men in their bathtub, who appeared to be unrelated to the others. After exchanging silent glances and words, Hidachi and Hikaru lay back on Ashken as though reaching a decision. Ashken was the only one who was completely perplexed, and he had the wise thought, what? Hot baths were surprisingly soothing. Ashken thought about stopping the world using the S key, but he noticed more silent people in the background while he was in the menu. Ashken made note of his findings, and quickly clicked to the audio area to put on the music not too loud, but enough to have some background ensemble. When he looked around, the water mist stopped moving, which was an amazing sensation. Ambience. Day began to play, and even though Ashken didn't enjoy it as much as Night or Rain, it was still a fantastic and engrossing song. After a few quality minutes, he found himself somewhat distracted by the music, unable to focus between listening to the music, reading subtitles, and giving meaning to words, and the strange echo and reverberations of the place didn't help either. He returned from his pause whirled and kept staring at the ceiling, while listening to any comments made by bathing patrons. But rather than sighing, which would have led to another discussion with the old guy, he went back to the music section and turned it off, focusing only on learning the language. As time went on, two strangers exited the warm onsen, new guests entered, and the elderly man and others conversed, albeit mostly in a joking way. A typical conversation starter was feeling very good, aren't you, followed by a few affirmative responses. Before attempting to mentally recite those basic words, Ashken thought to himself, this is a perfect opportunity for me to learn some common phrases. Even though he can plainly read the subtitles repeating most words, Ashken's biggest issue to yet has been that most people talk so quickly that he is unable to separate them. Everybody's speech, with all its peculiarities, seemed to blend together, making it even more difficult to sort through the chaos. This was in contrast to anime, where speech was frequently presented in a far more understandable manner, if that's even possible. He hasn't learned Japanese grammar yet, and he wasn't trying to because he thought it would be far more helpful to concentrate on looking at everyday terms, or those that he could actually recall. Even though his mind was racing and he was mentally repeating certain lines after seeing people who spoke English, he frequently felt a sense of loss, since he understood that the majority of what he had learned in the beginning was just forgotten. He wasn't upset because, despite everything that had happened to him and his circumstances, he couldn't think of a better place to learn than here. Onsen was generally a fairly quiet place where people were mostly concentrating on their own experiences, and only occasionally engaging in small talk. When the old guy he had been speaking to finally excused himself, Ashken stayed because he believed he could still get something from being here, but his two protégés did the same. But why haven't I heard my stealth leveling up for a long time? Ashton only realized that he was alone in the locker room when he last heard it level up. After previously reaching the 18th level while exploring the back alleyways and abandoned side streets, where he was frequently hidden as well, he was hidden there and advanced to the 19th level of the talent. As he sat there in stealth mode, he realized that it was truly the first of the 19th, which meant that he was being seen, and he had not advanced. Given how much time he spent on the main streets, he would likely suffer from awful skill leveling, if any, from strolling through more populated streets where he would also be noticed standing out. As he tried to recall the game's regulations, Ashton thought, though, it may be an illusion. Generally, walking into the wall in Whiterun's reach made someone level up to 100 in some hours. Ashton thought, and then sadly came to the conclusion, yeah, it is probably not an illusion. He quickly drank a soup from his stockpile to bring his appetite and sleep bars back to a manageable level, after finding out that he would receive a minor statistical penalty, but he was so exhausted from all this perverted Japanese education that he stopped and, for the first time, felt totally at ease in the bathtub. Ashton said, well, it's time to go, as she stepped out of the shower. And speaking of things, she said, I would prefer to finish other things today, and I'm not feeling well. He passed one of the onsen users while he was getting out of the bathtub, and as he peered at the person who was visible to him, he saw what seemed like a gaming prompt. Steal, said the gadget. When Ashton hit the symbolic E key, the world stopped, and when the player's game inventory appeared, he noticed that the man was wearing a towel over his head. For some reason, its worth was displayed as 3 ryo, and it was categorized as miscellaneous. There was a 78% chance that it would be stolen. After 10 seconds of hard staring at the option in front of him, Ashton recalled, he can get up each morning and take full breath, proud of himself, that everything he has, he earned himself, without any swindling, cunning, or cheating. Why did I ever think about that? Even though they might have murdered one person, Ashton smirked to himself and reprimanded himself, saying, what lovely words to live by. If the world hadn't been paused, he would be shaking his head amusingly. What would I do, Ashton wondered himself, if I needed a certain item to advance, and the only way to obtain it was by unethical means. But since power is power, it would be stupid to not use it. I can find much better ways to do it, like giving someone an item and taking it back, Ashton thought further, adding that taking weapons or armor from enemies would definitely come in handy. Not grinding it could mean the difference between life and death, she said. However, his system immediately saw Ryo as money, and he would rather have it in inventory than in a locker in the restroom. Ashton pointed to a possible error in his earlier behavior when he said, which could be suspicious, as some ninjas were to investigate it, and found none. Returning to the subject at hand, he had hundreds of Ryo in his system at the moment, each of which represented a golden coin in the same pile. No, that wouldn't do, Ashton replied, ignoring him because if a ninja were now at onsen and observing them, a coin would appear out of nowhere, and other things in his inventory, particularly vegetable soups, would also seem odd. After weighing the ramifications of serving the nude bather soup, Ashton concluded, though, it would be funny, on the subject. There was nothing else he could do here, nothing that would help him accomplish his goals, so he closed the window and grabbed his towel to shower and clean himself. He washed quickly in cold water when he noticed that someone else was changing outside, and proceeded to change in a locker room. He thought about using his trick again, possibly leveling some pickpocketing and sneaking, but when he began to approach a changing man from behind, it fell too. After changing, he left the bathroom and went straight through the blue curtain to the lobby. When he nodded and said goodbye to the manager, owner, or employee, he got the identical response he had heard from previous shopping excursions. The place seemed somewhat empty compared to when he had first arrived 2 hours ago, and the sun was full force, mercilessly flinging its lethal rays at frightened mortals. With a laugh and a certainly humorous view of the world, Ashton thought, well, quite an exaggeration, and made the decision to see what time it was, a task that was fortunately not too difficult to complete. It was 13 minutes past noon, according to the Skyrim system, so he decided he had plenty of time to find a smith, workshop, or something like that. He would not be going inside and asking for a job just yet, but he thought he might be able to persuade a smith to hire someone scrawny looking, which he looked like. He discovered that the onsen springs were marked as public baths, which would have been a helpful tool to identify the place for the first time he came around, rather than just relying on his hunch, even if the map indicated that he passed no forges, smiths, or anything related to weapons. Urkier. In fact, it displayed numerous icons of different businesses in this region, which unavoidably resulted in a large number of options. Since it was a new tool to him, he obviously needed to get used to all of its features, so he left the village center, in the hopes of finding some warehouses where traders stored their goods, like iron. It was a great opportunity to just walk through different streets and occasionally consult the map. When the village walls showed in the distance, he had to go sideways. He was traveling through a residential neighborhood with sporadic stores of various kinds in the corners. He even observed a stationery store, which was interesting to know in case he later discovered none nearer to his house. He decided to investigate the enormous buildings he could see in the distance, and arrived at what appeared to be a crafting sector, where the sound of hammers striking metal constantly shattered the din of people going about their daily lives. The region certainly had its own life, albeit not as spectacular as he had often anticipated. It appeared more like the start of an industrial age than a few workshops with unique inventiveness and apprentices. The entire space was enormous, with people lingering in various groups in front of enormous production halls that resembled some kind of factory. Oddly, the spaces between neighboring hangars were dotted with groves, greenery, and shrubberies, which was characteristic of the village's dense undergrowth and enormous size. To be honest, it all appeared somewhat planned, but it also appeared that someone had selected a central section of the forest, dully yellow gravel-like substance that lined the streets, laid some medium-sized roads, and connected several hangars to it. Since he had no excuse not to, he chose to follow one of the many trails that led through the woodland. Other paths intersected, and he found himself strolling and taking in the scenery when, to his surprise, the street noise disappeared a few meters away and was replaced by the forest ecosystem, which served as a peaceful natural barrier just a short distance from the district's bustle. At the little time he was at the park, he leveled twice, largely by going next to benches on the walks and avoiding sight. He passed a lot of people, including young couples, employees, and dog owners. Shortly after, he reached a clearing, where a playground was erected, with some kids playing and others sitting at tables on the small hill. He had no reason not to go and look, so he did, but when he got to the other side, he discovered something unexpected. A small stream of water flowing at the base of the hillock he was standing on, and a view of the entire village in the distance, with the warehouses from his entrance, a park with houses on one side and mansions or small closed-off districts on the other, as well as 3 hookage faces carved in the rock. No one at the tables would have been interested in hearing about his experiences. No one was particularly interested in his presence or his point of view, and regrettably, reality is frequently perceived personally. Do you like what you see? He would like to hear the cliché right now. He looked at the contented group of people sitting at tables and thought, or maybe they would, and I am just alienating myself on purpose, knowing that he would not find answers anyhow, primarily because of his language problems. Ashton said, but it is damn impressive. He took out an orange juice he had previously purchased from one of the stores, and drank some of it, pleasantly surprised that he could detect flavors, but he pointed out that he had already eaten chocolate chopsticks, so he was already aware of that. Ashton took one last look around before heading to an empty table nearby. Well, no use in thinking about it, it can be easily checked later, Ashton added, shrugging and focusing his newfound attention on the nearby residents. Ashton thought to himself, but it makes me wonder if actually eating stuff would satiate my hunger need, as he gazed out across a wide stretch of gigantic trees in the way he had come from. In fact, he could hardly see some of the early factory structures from that direction. Even if they weren't discussing revolutionary topics, he had to be informed on everything, or else he would learn how to characterize strange ants, blatantly unfaithful lovers, or obnoxious parents. He spent 15 minutes there, occasionally receiving perplexed looks from the locals, but mostly he just drank his juice and gazed around the hamlet, taking in all the sights he had always wanted to see. He thought about it in a general way, but it had something to do with him. Although this world is undoubtedly wonderful in and of itself, anything can happen when people are unable to express their gratitude to others. Who might dissuade someone from thinking that their ideological motivations are to destroy everything? What happens if they are surrounded by yes-sayers or like-minded individuals? That would stop him from turning into a monster, with all the power at his disposal, from trampled underfoot the homes, dreams, and futures of others in the name of his own dominance and power, to spending excessive amounts of time alone in his thoughts. He chuckled after giving it some thought. Though the explosion on that scale would certainly look impressive in real person, well, if I survived it, that is. Madara, with his dream to force everyone into slumber of happiness, Dadar, who looking at this village, would want nothing more than just to explode it away, seeking sick satisfaction from his art, stated him. He finished, decided his legs wanted to continue, and turned back the way he had come. I need to master the language ASAP, and make some connections with people, or else I'll end like all those maniacs from the show, he murmured. He levels up stealth again on his way out, reaching mastery of the 22nd level. He feels better overall, and may even have grown to love the hamlet as a result of his time at the park. As if, Ashton said to himself, smiling at the village government's internal joke. He even entertained outlandish theories, such as the tenable one that the parks were established purely to provide people with a sense of security. Ironically, he would have barely heard the contentious argument if it weren't for his subtitles, and it appeared to be taking place near the route he was now following. It was a few meters away from the walkway, coming from the back of the warehouse. He used his inventory to strip off all of his outer garments, exposing his briefs, because he had an inspiring idea, and didn't want to ruin his clothes, which he had previously learned might be ruined by blood. He then wriggled like a worm under a bush, wondering why he should listen to it despite the fact that it is extremely suspicious and against their privacy regulations. It's highly likely that he is, but it's not like he's in some strange isekai literature that other people read, so no one would know. He thought it was funny, but he shrugged his head because his stealth indicator informed him he was properly hidden. Ashken's thoughts becomes a strange labyrinth. It's too late anyway, so screw it. Would the author be so kind as to leave out the previous part? Of course he wouldn't. The following is how the conversation went. He explained to the greasy, lanky man, "Listen, Vernon, I make good money, really good, thanks to this damn war, but you know very well how the math works." He attempted to respond, but the man named Vernon interrupted him. "My 20 people can manufacture 130 standard kunai in 2 days, no more," he stated. Clearly irritated by the other man, the man even tried to persuade him to change his mind. "Shut up. Some of my men put in 12 hours a day at their jobs. I can't push them further," he said. "Regardless of whether you, Mr. Shibikawa, or even the Hokage want those kunai, I am unable to create an additional 1200 in 2 weeks on top of the current orders." With his hands folded across his breast, Vernon begged Imuga, you know quite well that we cannot fail this order. Of those 1200, complete at least 800. I'll find someone else to take the rest." 600, said Imuga, his face expressionless. Vernon began to respond, "I'm grateful. You." 2.5 normal rate, said Imuga, cutting the speaker off. When he realized that Imuga was unyielding, he swallowed and tried again, saying, "Imuga, we know each other, what? 5 years. You're aware that Mr. Shibikawa would murder me if he learned of this arrangement, aren't you?" The man's smile tightened a little. "Surely, you jest," he replied. Vernon stated in a scared voice. Vernon asked. After giving Vernon a stern look, Imuga leaned in and said, 2.5, out loud. Imuga scowled at Vernon when he changed so suddenly, and Vernon initially complied by responding, "Fine," grinning and shaking hands before adding, "Let's sign the contract," and removing a few papers and a pen from the bag, and placing them on top of it. Both men finished the ordeal in less than 2 minutes, because they were filling out the papers with practiced ease, and most of it had probably already been written. Vernon excused himself and left the back of the factory with a slight smirk on his face, while Ashken, still behaving like a single large caterpillar, wiggled back out of the bush, and got ready to put on his clothes. When he saw his body covered in muck, he frowned. He was plainly dirty, but he hadn't washed his clothes either. "Disgusting," said Ashken, looking at his face. Since the man was only wearing his briefs and covered in dirt, all of his plans to follow him while he was still in the woods to find out he was purchasing guns in case he had later made any were foiled. Instead, he chose to find some water, preferably hidden from view. When Ashken said, "Yet, it is stupid, there is high chance I'll get spotted, or worse, some ninja spots me and detains me for being improper, or alternatively will ask me some difficult for me to answer questions," he was clearly considering simply flinging his clothes to the ground and heading straight home to take a shower. However, the combat music began to play before he had finished the above, and his eye immediately moved to his indicator, alerting him to his discovery, so he turned around out of instinct. After a moment of shock, he eventually stopped the world and saw a squirrel-like thing hissing in front of him, motionless in space, with no other animals or people in the area. Now, getting dressed and pulling out a knife would be a clever move, but no, it's a lie, and the likelihood that it will happen is as slim as a lone squirrel attacking him in the park. Ashken wasn't sure if it was a ploy or if someone else was observing him from somewhere. No, the true motivation was much more straightforward. He wanted to avoid contracting rabies or any other unpleasant illness, so he quickly got up and fled to the warehouse. Unfortunately, the squirrel did not pursue because there was a tobacco smoker around. As though he had just begun smoking, the gentleman dropped the tobacco and ran away after blinking twice in quick succession, as he watched the filthy, nearly nude man sprinting toward him, emerge from the tree line into the tiny yard. The red dot indicated that the opponent was still present but not engaged in combat, and Ashken paused for a single second before turning back to the tree line, at which point the music ceased, and he resumed his hiding. His invisibility was disrupted, and he heard something from the corner behind him, as he began to travel to the opposite side of the woodland, where he planned to change before returning home. Remain calm. Ashken halted and turned to face the man who was observing him from the corner. "What are you doing here?" That's what the man said. Ashken responded, "Wait," and then he walked past the nearest bush to hide. Unfortunately, the dirt below had not been cleaned up when he utilized inventory to put on his clothes, after his stealth alerted him that he was hiding. Wrapped up and carrying his bag, he emerged from the clearing and approached the man, massaging his stomach. "What did you want?" Ashken asked the man. With one of the words she had learned today, or at least a similar phrase. It would be an understatement to say that the man was perplexed by his behavior, and Ashken was nearly feeling guilty at the man's blatant disregard for his earlier deeds. Ashken said, "Dajobu," which probably translates to, "Are you okay?" But now that it seemed right, he repeated, saying, "Dajobu, Dezuka," after reflecting on what he had discovered today. The man responded, "Yes, but you," and then appeared to come out. Onigiri Ashkin took the bowl of rice he had purchased that morning out of his bag, which was wrapped in some tissues. No, thank you, he responded, blinking as he looked at it. With a frown, Ashkin stuffed it back into his backpack. So, are we acting like that didn't happen? The man began to ask, and Ashkin looked down at him, staring into his eyes for a few awkward seconds before saying, all right. Say, do you want to wash your face and hands, or something? The man went on, showing off his intelligence by once again lifting his hands in submission. It was unusual for someone to voluntarily put their hand inside a stranger, so even though Ashkin answered, yes please, he was still a little uncomfortable and distrustful of the person. As he was being taken to the open faucet that appeared to be connected to one of the buildings, Ashkin had a frightening notion and took a step back from the other man, thinking, perhaps he's stranger than me. Is that acceptable? In an attempt to be helpful, the man continued, I can't really lead not employees to the showers. Ashkin's mind began to race with terror, searching for signs of dishonesty, but they could find nothing but the water and a man who might have stunned him by utilizing his vulnerability cleaning. Arthur said, so. Employee, kunai making. While standing sideways to the other individual. He opened the faucet, leaving a smudge of dirt on it, but he immediately rinsed it off with some water. To begin this small talk in his pseudo-Japanese. When he could discover no food in his active effects and no indication that the other man was planning an attack, he stopped the whirl and began cleaning his face and hands. Ashkin reprimanded himself by saying, I didn't check the roof for traps. Oh? Yes, we are capable of fulfilling orders for different varieties of kunai, the man said, looking puzzled by his comments, before he began to laugh uncomfortably. It is sometimes a monotonous job, but it has a decent pay, and there is always need for more kunai, so it seems stable, with minimal risk of injury. The man began to apologize as Ashkin was done drying himself. Sorry, I don't have any. Ashkin begins, pulling a damp but still useful towel from his pack. Towels. Huh, the man responds. Ashkin replied, everything is okay, thanks, utilizing one of the typical expressions. Well, I must say that you have scared me a little earlier, you know, I can't say that I recommend for you to be repeating whatever you were doing back then, the man remarked, with a hint of relief. Ashkin simply nodded and murmured, yes, sorry, before choosing to put on a front with the fewest words possible, in order to get a job, and find out what his Skyrim system could do. The other said, no problem, don't worry about it, each time stooping a little and stroking his head. So, job? Ashkin asked the man. To start is tormenting. What position? I asked the man, who appeared somewhat perplexed based on the furrowed brows. I want job, kunai making, Ashkin said, nodding and holding his arms across his chest, as though it were clear. His approach was straightforward. Convince the other person that their speaker is okay, and that they have simply misinterpreted something. It obviously backfired. You have an odd way of speaking. Are you from abroad? The man asked, scratching his head while maintaining a wrinkled brow. For a while, Ashkin wondered, are there any foreign visitors here? No, Ashkin replied, but his evasiveness didn't seem to persuade the man. My name is Ashkin, he said, bowing softly and placing a palm to his breast. What is my family name, now that I think about it? Ashkin saw his error, which might be significant when signing a contract or introducing oneself to others. Ashkin-san. The man inquired for explanation. Yes, Ashkin nodded to confirm. The man bowed and made the peculiar Japanese gesture of breaking their back in the middle. Well, nice to meet you, Ashkin-san. My name is Rikiteru Onagi. You can call me Onagi-san, he said. After saying, nice to meet you, Onagi-san, there was a little silence, which may have resulted from Ashkin's admission that he was uncomfortable with social conventions. However, as anime characters frequently use their first names in all social encounters, it might not be considered odd. They were usually ninja, though. Did he make a mistake again? Ashkin felt a little concerned. Well, how about we go to the foreman and he takes it from there? The man replied with a small stuttering giggle. Molded forms should be finished shortly, so I'll have to do my portion of the work. Ashkin answered, okay, and they moved silently between the buildings in the direction of the biggest hall they could see. He was taken up the stairs to the metal-framed upper floor, which had a few apertures for easy access to the smelter shafts, a huge vent that was likely connected to chimneys, and deflected any fumes created, and what appeared to be an office. They entered through the side door. Amuga-san, someone is looking for work. Onagi exclaimed as he banged on the door after noticing it was open. Ashkin wasn't surprised by the level of the conversation because it was most likely required because of the loud noises emanating from the hangar. Allow him in, shouted someone inside. Ashkin nodded to Onagi, then walked into a big office where a man was sitting and glanced at him. Ashkin pondered as she approached the man seated at the desk, whether he enjoys observing people's behavior while being closely watched, either to intimidate them, or to gain a better understanding of them through their body language. Amuga began by asking him, have you ever worked in this field? No, he said. If he had been familiar with the proper terms, he would have used smithing or forging. He stopped and continued. You'll receive 5 ryo per hour for now. If you learn fast and don't screw up, you will be able to get promotion and more responsible duties, said he. Then you will work as a support, in tying the ropes on kunai, learning how to sharpen and smoothen blemishes, as well as doing delivery jobs of iron ore or coal to smelter, or helping in securing goods, he stated. Then he inquired. Yes, Ashton replied. Good, the man responded, pulling out the form, give me your ID. Before pulling the towel and bathrobe from the bag and uttering the stupid words, Onsen, Ashton, made an attempt to look in his pockets for the ID he was referring to, despite the fact that he had no idea what it was. Stupid. The man growled at him, pinching his nose. It's against the law to move about during a conflict without identification, he said. I will have to report it to the police, so run, or it becomes a mess. If you don't come with it, say, within an hour. Ashton made an effort to stay mostly on the main roads because he was not familiar with the layout, but he was unable to locate his ID and hurried home. The village itself was somewhat peculiar. At moments it resembled tiny woodlands with sporadic clearings and streams of water, and at other times it resembled the center of a bustling metropolis. Ashton found it both repulsive and attractive in its own right, because of the erratic and even flamboyant changes in the landscape. But he interrupted the game to check his virtual world map for directions, so he didn't have much time to think about the chaotic setting he was in. Ashton searched his 180-degree frozen vision for anything that would help him get to the greater altitude he had planned to attain, but nothing seemed likely other than scaling a certain tree. He thought only one coherent thought, I screwed up, shit. He did his first tree climbing workout ever, unwilling to turn back, wrapping his arms around the tree waist high, embracing it with his legs this time, lifting his arms in a way that looked to bounce or propel it, and then catching it with his legs once again. His peculiar body was a huge help, protecting him from the tree trunk, and providing him with the power to break the embrace. When he got to a moderate level, he saw a child on the ground watching him, and he waved with one hand, while trying to see the top level behind him by gazing laterally. What happens next? He considered this after releasing his legs, and then tried to grasp with his hands, but he wasn't sure how to crouch on the trunk with them horizontally, without significantly compromising his capacity to give a hug. He said, not that he would die from diving this high, would he? After spotting what appeared to be at least 6 meters above the ground. Before beginning to fall again, he thought, yeah, nope, and then he added in his mind, no way I'm risking it, let's be real. When he spotted the boy glaring at him, Ashton's initial thought before searching for the other, easier path was, yeah, it sucks kiddo. He discovered one that would take up some of his valuable time, but in order to avoid wasting any more, he chose to make it simple, foolish. As he rushed, he received some strange looks, but he wasn't sure if he would there in time. Back alley's hell was the roughest part, but he managed to finish in around 20 minutes since, aside from that one setback, he ran non-stop and didn't feel fatigue. The middle-aged woman shouted, Wakateru-san, good afternoon, as he ascended his stairs. He paused, nodded, and continued, good day, I apologize before rushing to his house. Wakateru, what have you been up to? What is happening, Ashton? He heard her ask as she walked up to him, sounding very concerned. You should apologize to Mr. Lanagi. He might Mr. Lanagi told me that you didn't go to the bakery today, and that he would twist your head off if he saw you as he was opening the door. When he opened the door, Ashton discovered that he was having trouble hearing the dialogue. As a result, he had to temporarily stop the reality to read a portion of it. Forgive you, if you will go and apologize to him. Lady, thank you for telling me my name, but I'm in a hurry right now, Ashton thought, but then he had a specific notion. The woman was somewhat startled when he muttered, oh, dropped his keys, bent down to retrieve them, turned off his sneak mode, and leaped to his feet. Even though there was no speaking button and hitting E had no impact, it was helpful to know her name, because he noticed that she had a flavor text on her that said, Shirin Akagawa. He murmured, thank you Mrs. Akagawa. Sorry, and bowed slightly before going inside his home. He simply waved to the woman and shut the door, not knowing the word he would have said later. He looked around the inside, first concentrating on the mirror and the cupboard underneath, but finding nothing that might have been an ID. He then went to his bedroom and looked inside the chest, which was there, but there was nothing of that kind. Where could it be? Ashton thought as she peered at the other cabinets and cupboards. He left his backpack inside the house and stole the plate he eventually discovered in one of the cupboards, which had his photo and what he believed to be his last name and family name on it. I'll clean up later, Ashton reminded himself, and he secured the doors with his key before running to the warehouse, but he didn't follow the same path. After climbing the barricades and continuing to the balustrades in front of a tree he had left behind, he leaped 2 meters away, landing directly at the tree. He landed on it and embraced it, saving its life. He began to giggle as he fell down, unconcerned by his performance. He feigned to be upset as though it hurt when he reached the bottom, and saw that the child was not there as an audience. If he appeared at the foreman with his ID and immodest smile, who could tell?